Hi everyone, and welcome to our Data One-to-One podcast. My name is Sven Hermans, and I will be your host for today's episode. We are joined here today by Stijn Christiaens, who is co-founder and chief data citizen at Collibra.
That's right.
Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me over.
How are you doing today?
Well, ça va, it's the first time in a long while that I've come out to have business travel again. So I'm a little bit excited, I'm a little bit anxious, but really happy to be here.
Could you maybe start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, so Stijn from Kkuribra, one of the co-founders of the company. That's now 13 years ago that we started the company in 2008. And over those 13 years, I really had a variety of roles. So I've been chief operating officer there, where I was responsible for pre-sales, post-sales, partnerships. So I've seen a lot of POCs, pilots, implementations, worked with a lot of our partners. In 2014, moved to New York, where I became the chief technology officer, responsible for product, the roadmap, UX, research and education, marketplace, and technology partnerships. And for the last 2 years or so, our company has grown, right, consistently over 13 years, which means you as an individual also have to grow a lot. And for the last 2 years, I'm running our own data office as what we call our chief data citizen, indeed.
Chief data citizen. So data citizen, that's a word you typically use at Collibra, right?
Yeah, we like to talk about the data citizen a lot. Yeah, that's right.
Can you maybe explain a bit more what that role entails, the chief data citizen?
Of course. So, like I said earlier, our company has been growing a lot to the size that systems and processes become really, really important. Like a lot of our large customers, but still a little bit smaller, but the structure is important, right? The systems and the processes. So we said, okay, it's time for us now to put our money where our mouth is, eat our own dog food, drink our own champagne, whatever you want to call it. And we set up our own data office, which is one of the main places where we collaborate with our customers as well. And the reason that we did that is to work in these systems and processes. But the reason that we also did it is because at Kkuribra, we believe that today everybody is what we call a data citizen, right? So that's everybody who uses data to do their job. And today we think everyone in an organization somehow, somewhere touches on data.
It's not only
the citizen is really important to us. We said, okay, at Kkuribra, everyone is a data citizen too, right? So let's run our data office and let's make the title the chief data citizen, as opposed to what most people know as the chief data officer. So I'm essentially leading data at Kkuribra. But because I also have a little bit of an evangelism role, right? Everything we do in the data office, we're very hands-on, right? So there's a lot of things we learn while we're using our own product at Collibra. And we like to give those learnings back also to the market, to our customers, to our partners. So that's why the role has a little bit of an evangelism aspect to it, and why we call it the chief data citizen.
Yeah, so it's not only internal, but also external to other companies.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So at Collibra, you help other companies to help managing their data.
Yeah.
You have several products and services such as a data catalog, data governance, data lineage. What would you say is a mission of Collibra?
We do indeed have a whole bunch of products at the moment, but it's a good thing you're asking about the mission, because that's really where we come from and what we're going to try and achieve or change in the world, if you will. And when we started the company, at that moment in time, we already felt, data is important. But if you look at how organizations deal with data, it feels like there must be a better way, right? There must be a better way of doing this. For us, in our space, everybody talks a lot about, data is a new oil, it's a new soil, it's a new gold, whatever. But we like to think more of data as water, right? You want it clean, trustworthy, like you're drinking from the tap, for example, but it's also reusable in different ways as opposed to oil, which you burn and then it's gone. So for us, data will become that essential asset for every organization in the world, and they need a better way of managing it, right? So what we want to do is make sure that all the data citizens in the organization, so everyone who uses data to do their job, that they can easily connect the right data to the right algorithms, models, insights, and ultimately, very importantly, the business outcomes. So we want to make all the organizations data intelligent organizations. Because if you look inside a company and you look at the data asset, it really only works, quote unquote, as a team sport, right? So we're all united by data in getting to those business outcomes.
Okay, thanks. So you work with a lot of different organizations. You've seen many data-related projects. What kind of need do you see today in the market?
I think there's a number of things that I'm seeing as a need in the market. One is a lot of organizations talk about data as a strategic asset, but I feel that they're not necessarily always properly organizing or executing for that. So one thing that's missing that I see still a lot in the market is how to best say it, a business infrastructure maybe for data, which means that business people are really enabled to do whatever they need to do with data, which means they need to have certain tools and technologies, of course, right? But they also need certain roles and responsibilities so that they know what can I do with data, but also what should I not do with data. And they need certain organizational structures in the company as well. They need certain processes. For example, if you say, okay, I want to get data that exists in our organization, how do I get it? What is the process for me to get it? Who do I talk to? So one is the business infrastructure around the data asset is missing in most companies still. I think also a lot of executive understanding of the data asset. It's already changed over the last 13 years, right? But a lot of executive education, MBAs, etc. How much are they really teaching about data? So a lot of the C-levels, a lot of the executives don't really understand the data asset just yet, right? And they need to. And then what else is missing? I think, what it is that Collibra is offering is, of course, missing, right? A data intelligence platform, if you will, a system of record for them to, at scale, manage that data asset with a lot of the components in there, right? People need to do a lot more about privacy, obviously, whether that's for regulatory reasons or for trust with their customers. Quality is becoming increasingly important as, AI is important, and the AI monster eats data, right, to work. So if the data is bad, the outcome is also bad. But in summary, right, that business infrastructure, the executive understanding, the system of record for the data asset, and then it breaks down into some other more point needs.
So now you touched upon the different needs, but how is Collibra able to fill that need?
Well, first of all, I think because of our mission, we're trying to figure out all the things that are relevant to that mission to make everybody united by data, which breaks down, as I said, in a few components. But maybe the best way that I found over these 13 years of explaining in a very short time, like in 30 seconds, what we do and the problem that we solve is maybe by playing a little betting game between us, if that's okay. It's 30 seconds. And the clock already started ticking, by the way. So I will bet you €100 that it's easier for you to buy a book online than it is for you to find your own data in your own organization, right?
That's a bet I cannot win, I think.
Well, typically that's the outcome. Yeah. So most people do understand. Okay, if I need to get access to data, they start thinking, how would I even begin, right? Whereas buying a book online, you just go there to some catalog and you're buying it. So one part of what Kkuribra solves is we offer organizations that sort of catalog for their data asset. So now you have a place where you can actually go search for the data that's available inside the company. But the second part to that is that when you have that catalog, but let's say the book never arrives, you bought it, but it doesn't arrive, or it's damaged, or you cannot reach the seller, you're not going to use that service more than a few times because you don't trust it. And the same thing is true for that catalog of data inside the organization. If people don't trust it, if there is no cornerstone of trust, like who is the owner for this data, how can I get access to it, is it the right data, etc., etc. If they don't have that cornerstone of governance that brings trust, then the catalog initiative is typically not going to be sustainable, right? So in the 30 seconds, I didn't count, but you have one piece of what Collibra solves is the catalog, right? Another piece is the governance portion, which is around roles and responsibilities and process. And then we have a few other pieces like lineage, where did my data come from, privacy, for example, like the process registry, or which business process is using which data and with which legal basis, for example. So there's a few components to what we're solving.
Okay. And I can imagine that if you have all those tools managing the data of organizations, the data can be in different places, right? So a few years ago, maybe a decade ago, I think organizations were still setting up their own clusters, managing those data lakes and having Hadoop clusters and everything. Yeah. And today, more and more companies are moving their data to the cloud, to public clouds like Google Cloud, AWS, Azure. What do you think of this new cloud era?
I think it's fascinating. So our viewpoint at Collibra, again, for the last 13 years, let's say decade, we've seen the data landscape change a lot. To your point, take for example the data warehouses in companies, right? They have existing data warehouses, they have existing ETL technology, but even in the decade of the past decade, I would say, there's already been disruption there, right? So the data warehouses and the data infrastructure went through that whole big data phase where people were talking about, elephants in Hadoop and MapR and Cloudera and Hortonworks as big players in there. And indeed, they were then setting up their own clusters and hiring network engineers to do that for them. But then only a few years later, all the questions that I got, can Collibra integrate with my big data cluster XYZ? All of a sudden, they started significantly shifting. I saw that first in the US, but now also in Europe, to the cloud, right? It wasn't no longer, can it work with Hortonworks, but rather, can it work with BigQuery, for example? Yeah. Right. So I started looking at this cloud thing and how it was affecting our data management space. And I realized that from my viewpoint, the data management space is currently at breakneck speed being commoditized by the cloud players. Why do I say that? Because the traditional data management vendors, they're great players with great revenue and great businesses, but at the same time, they're small compared to the software titans, really, like a Microsoft and a Google and an AWS, right? Which are orders of magnitude bigger and fighting a battle over that market. So at a minimum, for the next 3 to 5 years, I see that trend of moving into the cloud continue, and probably a lot longer, right? Because if I'm not mistaken, combined with those 3 big vendors, they did 100 billion in revenue in cloud last year, but still growing at more than 40% year over year, right? So you can easily see how that trend is going to continue for a number of years, and how ultimately, organizations don't set up their own water plants, right? They don't set up their own electricity plants, maybe a backup generator or so, but ultimately these things are being commoditized. So similarly with data centers, they'll have all of their, storage and compute running in the cloud.
As a service.
That's right.
Okay. But still, I think we clearly see that shift, but I don't think that all organizations are already convinced. Some still have concerns about their data being managed by a third party. What do you think of that, about those concerns?
I understand the concerns, and I think to a degree they're valid, right? Because there are some challenges. We'll talk about that in a minute. But at the same time, I'm thinking, well, let's look at systems of record for a bit, right? CRM, ERP, those things with like a Salesforce, NetSuite, Workday, etc. They've been running in the cloud really since the 2000s, right? Salesforce, I think, started in 98 or 99, something like that. So organizations are already running a lot of their important processes and the corresponding data in the cloud for at least 2 decades, roughly. Whereas the whole, hey, we need to put our data into the cloud is happening for the last, let's say, 7 years or so. And for a lot of people, it's like, ooh, is this the right thing to do? Is it going to be safe? Well, your data is already in the cloud, right? It's already in the CRMs and the ERPs already in the cloud. So why the extra concern now, right? But I get it, right? Because what is a challenge with the cloud is that as an infrastructural component for a lot of these companies, it's completely new, right? But a lot of the technologies and services are also new. So maybe they don't have the resources that are scaled up. And maybe they're a little bit afraid, okay, if I'm going to put this data into the cloud, even though the cloud provider is fully secure, what if I do a wrong configuration and accidentally expose my bucket to the internet, right? And open myself up for a certain level of risk in data breaches. So I understand there's some hesitation because they need to scale up and tool up and make that move into the cloud. But as organizations acquire those skills, I'm sure the concerns will dissipate.
In the past years, there have been some increasing regulations, especially GDPR in Europe. I don't think that it's always easy for big companies to manage those and to stay compliant.
No, not in the least, because of the sheer number of them. For example, you had 2016 bring GDPR, but in the meantime at Collibra, I think we're tracking over 150 privacy regulations, which are, and I'm simplifying, like GDPR spin-offs, that every country or region, for example, in the US, many states have their own privacy regulations that they've set up. So if you're a global business, that in itself is quite a challenge to deal with. And we're not even talking about regulations surrounding like data sovereignty, which have come up because certain countries and regions decided that they want to have the data on their territory to protect it in a way. But my advice for regulation is, first of all, don't panic, right? The regulations, especially around privacy, are meant to protect the consumer, the individual, against the abuses, which are really easy to do when you have just a little bit of data. There's so many things you can do and do wrongly for those consumers. So putting some protection in place is a good thing, because in this case, it's going to increase really the level of trust with your customer or the people you service, your organization services. And that's very important, right? Like if you're dealing with a bank, you want to trust the bank. If the bank says, okay, I'm going to abuse your data, maybe, do you feel comfortable leaving your money with them, for example? So that trusted relationship is important and is going to increase in importance over the next couple of years for sure. But the approach that I would take is say, okay, the regulation is, we need to do it. So it's creating certain budgets internally. And then you can use those budgets to do foundational things, which you have to do anyways. For example, one thing that GDPR requires you to do is, okay, you need to have a process registry. Which business processes do I have, with which I create value for the customer? And which data is that business process consuming or using? And for what purpose, right? And is there a legal basis or is there agreement with the customer that the data can be used for that purpose? So having that in itself is good, because as a business owner, it gives you the ability to say, okay, what if we change our business process? How do we have to change our data flows, for example? Which systems do we have to touch? But also, From a protection point of view, it gives you a map of your castle, right? Imagine the data castle, right? Imagine you have a castle and you need to protect it from people who want to steal your code, your data. Then without a map, you don't know where the weak spots are or where the most value sits and where you have to put the relevant protections in place. So in that sense, what GDPR requires you to do is to put such a map in place, which is convenient for making certain business decisions, but also convenient for putting certain protections in place. So don't panic and use the regulatory aspect to put these foundational aspects in place, which will help you not just with one regulation, but with multiple.
Okay. Actually, I like the comparison with a castle and a map. But I can imagine that, okay, if you're managing a small castle, it can be easy to find which data is where and how to protect it. But what if you have like this big castle? How can you make sure that everyone, first of all, finds what it needs? And then, like you said, indeed, also to protect it.
Well, if you have a big castle, let's say you're some large multinational, maybe you even have multiple castles, right? So the bigger it gets, the quote unquote, the bigger the map should also get to a certain degree. And when you have to make a map that big, you have to change the way you do it. So for example, one thing that becomes really important is establishing a culture of data, right? Are your managers or executives asking for data to support decisions, right? Are they showing the example? And think about it a little bit. You have to make everyone in that large castle or collection of castles think about the data so that they can locally understand and compile their little piece of the map. For example, let's compare this with another asset in a company, something that every organization knows, the money asset. So if I'm a chief financial officer, my job is not just to, manage that money asset properly, but to make sure that everybody across all my castles thinks about money in a responsible way. So I'm going to do that by leading the example, but also by setting up responsibilities and processes like, hey, budgeting and expense reports, etc. So I'm making everyone in the organization think about the data assets, and thus I'm making everybody sort of a participant or a contributor, or at a minimum a consumer of those maps that protect the castle.
Okay, thank you. So that's already, we've been talking a lot about today, the challenges we have today, and you also mentioned that it's going so fast and it's growing so much. What type of challenges do you think we will face in the future?
So I think the regulatory aspect will definitely continue, right? So that's going to remain a challenge for organizations to keep that into account, whether it's data protection or data privacy or sovereignty. Those will continue, so they need to keep in focus. I think that trusted relationship with the consumer is also going to be important. But then think about what a lot of organizations are attempting right now is, like, for example, AI and machine learning initiatives. A lot of organizations are currently testing them out. They're in prototype, in pilot phase, and they're trying to get to production stages. That'll take a few years. But think about the challenge for that, right? You don't just have people looking at a dashboard and making a decision, maybe, one decision per minute or one decision per hour or day. The frequency is very low, but when you have AI making decisions and automatically performing actions maybe for the customer, you're making 1,000 decisions per minute. So if you're making a decision as a human, you have the ability to shoot yourself in the foot once a minute. But as a machine learning algorithm, you have the ability to have a machine gun shoot you in the foot 1,000 times per second. So in that sense, I think the aspect of quality is also going to massively increase for companies. Because again, AI is the beast that feeds on data. And if it has bad data quality, it has a bad diet, and then it's garbage in, garbage out. So regulation, privacy, trust with the customer, and definitely quality are going to be challenges upcoming for companies.
Okay. If I'm a new company only starting my data analytics journey, what type of advice would you give me?
Well, first of all, I would stress the data strategy as part of the business strategy, because oftentimes I see that data people can sometimes love data a little bit so much that they say, okay, I'm doing data management for data management's sake. So you always have to think about what is my data strategy and how does it fit into the business strategy? Essentially, how are you going to deliver those business outcomes? Whether that's making more money or saving more costs or being more compliant or completing the mission, fill in the blanks, right? And next to that, the buy-in, right? You need buy-in of relevant executives because data is a team sport, once again. So go out there and with your business stakeholders, collect what use cases they have around their business outcomes where data could play a role, right? Map out those use cases and put them in a value matrix, if you will. And then you can use those to really get that initial buy-in and use the success with those first low-hanging fruit, high-value use cases to really also show to people that it's easy to do this, win their hearts and minds, and really start building out, which will take a few years, that data culture.
Yeah. So it's really about connecting that business with the data team and creating that culture. Do you also have like a list of common mistakes that you see at companies that are just starting?
I think there's a lot of mistakes, most common ones or maybe most big ones. I think a lot of organizations do a little bit of look at my hands, right? We're not ready for things yet. We're not mature enough yet. And they just don't start, right? So not starting is in itself a mistake, right? Because you're also making a decision to do nothing, which means your competitors maybe can take an advance on you, right? Second is to look at it way too technically. If you have a data warehouse A and it's for whatever reason not working for you, and then you replace it by technology B, but you're as an organization and as a process or as a people doing exactly the same thing, just with a different technology, then you're probably not going to solve the problem either, right? It's not always the technology. So a lot of times data is often too much seen as a technology initiatives, and people forget the people and the process aspect to it. And another big mistake is not getting that high enough executive visibility, executive sponsorship, right? So they're missing the data strategy, or they're missing a data strategy that's not fitting into a business strategy. And then people at the executive level, the C-level, it's not a priority for them because there's no strategy that shows it's a priority for them. So it doesn't get wide enough. It becomes a too limited initiative.
Maybe just as a last question about Collibra. So what's still on your roadmap to keep bringing innovative ideas to the market, and what kind of services do you still have in mind?
Well, there's a whole bunch. Remember when we started Cobra 13 years ago, we became the leader in the space, the category we created as a technology category of data governance. And then we added different components, right? We added catalog 2014, 15-ish. We added privacy and risk for the privacy aspects, like the regulatory aspects. We added lineage. So we've already added a bunch of components into what we call our data intelligence cloud. Shortest on what's ahead for us is definitely the data quality aspect. We just acquired a company only in February of this year, right? So for us, really integrating those people into our company, the technology into the data intelligence cloud is a big priority because we see a lot of need for it in the market. We just talked about that. So data quality is going to be a big priority for us also in the next couple of years going forward. And then next to that, the continued build out of our data intelligence cloud. With Kkuribra, we believe there's a lot of overlap on the data asset. We see people, in the data lake space who, set up a catalog so they know what's in their lake. And then in a completely separate part of the organization, you have people in legal who are doing process registries. And then somewhere else again, in IT or under the CISO, they're like building that, data castle map, right? For protection reasons. But really these different groups in the company are doing the same thing, right? They're all making simplifying, right? But they're all making a data map of the data asset. And at Collibra, we believe, that should be in one place, right? And those people, data architects, data engineers, privacy people, security people, analysts, chief data officers, what have you, they're really all working together, right? They're all one team doing that team sport of the data asset. They're all united by data. So in that sense, we believe it should be in one platform. And for Collibra, that's a big priority, to continue building out that one platform, to continue providing that with the relevant enterprise features, to always make it bigger and better, so that the platform supports all of the personas that are touching and collaborating around the data asset in the organization.
Thank you very much, Stan. I think you clearly showed us that Collibra is at the forefront of data analytics, and you're one of the most knowledgeable people I've met in this area. So
thanks.
Thank you. We've talked about the present, the future. I think I'm convinced that our listeners will have been able to get some insights out of this.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me over. It was a pleasure talking. And everybody have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.